Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiasts. If you're like me, you've spent countless hours grappling with the works of the greats, like Plato and Aristotle.
Of course.
But have you ever stopped to think about the people who've dedicated their lives to understanding and interpreting these giants?
It's a fascinating lineage.
Yeah. Today we're taking a deep dive into the world of Ammonius of Alexandria.
A philosopher and commentator who lived around the late 5th and early 6th centuries.
Exactly. We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on him as our guide. It's a pretty in-depth scholarly overview of his life,
His work.
his impact.
It's really well researched.
Yeah. So our mission, for all you philosophy nerds out there, is to shed some light on Ammonius's key contributions to philosophy.
And his methods of interpreting Aristotle are particularly interesting.
Right. Like, what can that teach us about how philosophical ideas evolve over time? All right, let's start with the basics. Who was Ammonius, and what was his world like?
Well, we can't talk about Ammonius without talking about his intellectual family tree.
Oh, this is interesting.
His father, Hermaeus, was a philosophy teacher in Alexandria,
Okay.
and he studied under Syrianus in Athens.
So we're talking about a direct connection to the heart of late ancient Platonism.
Absolutely.
And there's this amazing little tidbit about Ammonius's mom, Adesia.
Oh, yeah.
She was supposed to marry Proclus,
No way. The Proclus.
the one and only.
Wow. That's huge.
Right.
Proclus, if you don't know, was like this major figure in Neoplatonism.
A titan.
But something happened. They didn't end up getting married, and she married Hermaeus instead.
What a wild turn of events. It's like a what-if moment in the history of philosophy.
It really makes you wonder.
So Ammonius grew up immersed in this world of philosophy. He even went to Athens to study under Proclus himself.
That's right.
And then he returned to Alexandria and started teaching at the school of Apollo.
Now, Alexandria during this period was a melting pot of cultures and ideas, a real hub of activity. It was a major center for Christian thought. But the school of Apollo represented this kind of Hellenic pagan learning.
So you can imagine the tension.
Right. The intellectual sparks flying.
Exactly. Now, the question that pops up here is, how did a non-Christian philosophical school like Apollo's not just survive, but thrive in such a Christian-dominated city?
Good question. And it leads us to one of the more debated parts of Ammonius's life.
Ooh, some juicy historical gossip.
A bit of intrigue.
Lay it on me.
It all revolves around this supposed agreement that Ammonius made with the Christian bishop of Alexandria.
An agreement? What kind of agreement?
The sources are a little vague. There are different interpretations. Some people think Ammonius agreed to tone down the theurgy.
Dirgy.
That's like a system of ritual practices.
Okay.
Others say he agreed to focus only on Aristotle and kind of leave Plato by the wayside.
Interesting.
And then there are some more critical interpretations that see it as a betrayal of his pagan colleagues.
Scandalous.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a mystery.
It is. But like with any good historical mystery, we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Right.
Richard Sorabji, a prominent scholar of ancient philosophy, suggests as a more practical explanation.
Let's hear it.
Maybe Ammonius simply agreed not to make his school a center of pagan ritual.
So just keep things low-key.
Yeah. You know, as a way of making sure the school could continue operating in a predominantly Christian context. It doesn't have to be about betraying anyone.
More of a strategic compromise.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Exactly. It reminds us that philosophy doesn't happen in a vacuum.
There's always a context.
Right. Another thing to consider is how Ammonius's teaching was funded.
Oh yeah, the money trail.
Unlike in Athens, where schools often had endowments and communal living, things were different in Alexandria.
How so?
Well, there's this question of whether Ammonius received a municipal stipend, like a public salary.
I see.
His father had one, but it's not clear if Ammonius did. Maybe he mostly relied on student fees.
Interesting. So it's possible that his need to attract students influenced his teaching or the topics he focused on.
Possibly.
Okay. Let's shift gears and talk about Ammonius's legacy as an Aristotelian commentator.
Yeah.
That's where his influence really shines through.
Right. He's seen as the founder of the Alexandrian tradition of commentary on Aristotle.
That's huge. An entire school of thought dedicated to interpreting one philosopher.
And he had some pretty famous students, too. Asclepius, Philoponus, Simplicius, Olympiodorus.
Big names in late ancient philosophy.
Yeah. And even Damascus, who was a critic of Ammonius in some ways,
Cat.
he acknowledged that Ammonius was a master at interpreting Aristotle, even more so than Plato.
Interesting.
So this emphasis on Aristotle, that became a hallmark of the Alexandrian school.
And what about the commentaries themselves? What do they tell us about Ammonius's approach?
Well, most of what we know comes from his lectures, which were heavily influenced by Proclus
Okay.
and Syrianus. So when Ammonius interprets Aristotle, he's often looking through this lens of Iamblichian Neoplatonism.
Iamblichian Neoplatonism.
Right. It emphasizes ritual and hierarchy in reality.
Okay, I'm following.
But there is one exception, his commentary on De Interpretatione. That one he wrote himself, specifically for publication.
Ah, so we get a more direct look at his thoughts on Aristotle's work on language and logic.
Exactly.
Now, it's important to note that Ammonius didn't ignore Plato completely.
No, not at all.
There are references to his lectures on Plato's dialogues, like the Gorgias and the Phaedo.
Yeah. Olympiodorus, one of his students, actually cites him.
Oh, really?
And from those citations, we can see that Ammonius brought his own unique wit and insights to Plato's work, too.
I'm curious. Give me an example.
Okay. In the Gorgias, Plato talks about different kinds of rhetoric.
Right.
And Ammonius, he compares these different kinds of rhetoric to 3 types of physicians.
Oh, this sounds intriguing.
There's the flattering physician,
Okay.
who tells you what you want to hear but doesn't actually help.
Ah, the sugarcoater.
Then there's the genuinely helpful physician who might be a bit blunt.
Straight to the point.
Exactly. And then there's the intermediate type who tries to strike a balance.
So he's connecting the art of persuasion to the art of healing.
And using this clever analogy to make Plato's arguments more relatable.
I love it. And there are these little glimpses of Ammonius's personality that come through in his teaching.
Yeah, like his comment about believing in Egyptian magic as a kid.
Makes him more human.
More relatable.
Right, not just some abstract philosophical figure.
And we also see him critically engaging with other beliefs.
For example.
Like his view on astrology.
Okay.
He acknowledged the influence of celestial bodies, but he believed the soul's autonomy ultimately trumped those influences.
So he's not just accepting everything at face value, he's thinking critically about these different ideas.
Exactly. So while his main focus was Aristotle, he clearly had a deep and nuanced relationship with Plato.
Right. Now, as philosophers, we're naturally curious about Ammonius's own philosophical positions. What did he believe?
Well, this is where things get a little tricky. Much of what we know about him comes from his students' notes.
Ah, the filter of interpretation.
Right. Plus, he was so heavily influenced by Proclus that it's hard to always separate their ideas.
So it's a bit of a puzzle to piece together his own views. And there was this older scholarly trend to portray a sharp divide between the Alexandrian and Athenian schools of Neoplatonism.
Yeah, but recent scholarship is painting a more complex picture.
More interconnected.
Exactly. I mean, Hermaeus studied in Athens, Ammonius studied under Proclus. There was a lot of exchange going on.
So maybe the differences weren't as stark as we once thought.
Right. It's more about nuances and degrees of emphasis.
Okay. So, with all that in mind, what can we say about Ammonius's Neoplatonic commitments?
Well, he definitely operated within a Neoplatonic framework.
Okay.
Like he saw the ultimate goal of philosophy as ascending to the common principle of all things.
The source of everything.
Exactly. And he identified this principle with the one goodness itself.
That's classic Neoplatonism.
Right. And we see him interpreting Aristotle through this Neoplatonic lens.
Give me an example.
Okay. Aristotle makes this distinction between spoken sound,
Okay.
affections of the soul, and external things.
Right.
And Ammonius connects that to the Neoplatonic hierarchy of the soul, intellect, and the one.
So these different levels of reality emanating from a single source.
Exactly. But one of his most significant contributions, at least from a historical perspective, is his interpretation of Aristotle's concept of God.
Tell me more about that.
Well, Ammonius argues that Aristotle's God isn't just the final cause.
The ultimate goal that everything is drawn towards.
Right. But also the efficient cause.
The active creator of the universe.
Exactly. And this was a big deal because it helped reconcile Aristotle's theology with Plato's.
Because Plato had a much more active creator god.
Right. For the demiurge.
Yeah, so Ammonius is basically bridging that gap between the two.
He's saying that even in Aristotle's system, God isn't just this passive attractor. He's actively involved in bringing the world into being. And this interpretation had a huge impact on later thinkers, Arabic philosophers, even Aquinas.
Wow.
It became a key part of how people understood Aristotle for centuries. And there's another aspect of Ammonius's thought that's really interesting, especially for us as philosophers.
Okay.
His engagement with the problem of determinism.
Oh, free will versus fate. That's a juicy one.
Right. And in his commentary on De Interpretatione, he goes beyond Aristotle's famous sea battle argument.
You mean the one about whether a statement about a future sea battle is already true or false?
That's the one.
Yeah.
Ammonius introduces two more arguments for determinism.
Two more. Okay, I'm listening.
The first one is called the Reaper argument. It's about how if we will something to happen in the future, doesn't that make it necessary?
Interesting.
But the second argument is the one he thought was more important. The argument from divine foreknowledge.
If God knows what's going to happen, doesn't that mean it has to happen?
Exactly. That's the challenge.
So how did Ammonius respond to this?
His response to the divine foreknowledge argument is particularly insightful. He draws on Iamblichus.
Okay.
And he argues that the way God knows things is not the same as how those things exist.
What does that mean?
So God might know future events with absolute certainty,
Okay.
but that doesn't make those events necessary in themselves.
I see.
Like the fact that God's knowledge is definite doesn't mean there's no room for contingency in the world.
So it's possible for God to know the future without it being completely fixed.
Exactly. It's a subtle distinction, but it has huge implications for how we think about free will.
And it influenced later discussions on the topic.
Massively. And when it comes to the sea battle argument itself, Ammonius takes an approach that's similar to Boethius.
Okay.
He introduces this distinction between truth in a definite manner
Okay.
and truth in an indefinite manner.
Interesting. Go on.
He says that statements about future contingent events, like the sea battle, do have a truth value.
They were either true or false.
Right. But that truth value isn't definitively determined until the event happens or doesn't happen.
So the law of excluded middle still applies. The statement is either true or false. We just don't know which one yet.
Right. It acknowledges that the future is still open.
Gotcha. It's a nuanced way of navigating this tricky philosophical problem.
Exactly.
Okay, so Ammonius was clearly a deep thinker, grappling with some of the most fundamental questions in philosophy.
Absolutely.
But what about his long-term impact? How did his ideas spread?
Well, his most obvious legacy is the Alexandrian school of commentary. His students carried on his work.
Became the leading commentators of their time.
Right. They ensured that his interpretations and his way of reading Aristotle continued to be influential.
And his influence wasn't limited to the Greek-speaking world.
No, not at all. His works and those of his students were translated into Persian, Arabic, Syriac.
Wow, so he had an impact on Islamic philosophy as well.
Big time. Like Sardis of Urshena, he studied under Ammonius, and he was instrumental in bringing Aristotelian philosophy, as understood through that Alexandrian lens, to the East.
Fascinating. And even in the West, Ammonius's ideas found a way in.
Through translations, like William of Morbic's translation of his De Sur Interpretation commentary.
Which influenced Aquinas.
Right. It's not just the content of his work that was influential.
No.
The way he structured the study of philosophy.
What do you mean?
He advocated for starting with logic, then moving on to ethics, physics, mathematics, and theology.
A comprehensive approach.
Right. And his introductory lessons on logic became really popular.
So he was a teacher in the truest sense of the word. He wasn't just preserving the past.
He was shaping how people learned about philosophy for centuries to come.
To sum it all up for our philosophical audience,
Yeah.
Ammonius made 3 really significant contributions.
Right.
First, he founded this incredibly influential school of Aristotelian commentary.
That's a big one.
Second, he tried to reconcile the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, particularly with that argument about God being the efficient cause.
That's such a key point.
And third, he really delved into these complex philosophical problems like determinism and future contingency.
He was a master of detail.
It's incredible to think how his work from all those centuries ago continues to resonate with us today.
It shows the power of engaging with the big questions.
And as you continue to explore philosophy, consider this. How can engaging with the questions that Ammonius tackled enrich your own understanding of these ideas?
And if you're really intrigued by Ammonius, I highly recommend checking out the work of his students.
Yeah, like Philoponus and Simplicius.
They took his ideas in all sorts of fascinating directions.
It's a whole world of philosophical exploration waiting for you.
So go out there and discover it.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.